Disclaimer: all names, locations, and identifiable details in this story have been altered to protect the privacy of the individuals involved. This podcast is a dramatised account of real investigative work conducted by South Wales Private Investigations. Listener discretion is advised, as some scenes may be intense or upsetting. Hello, I'm Kirk, an investigator for South Wales Private Investigations. For years, I've delved into mysteries that most people wouldn't believe, stories that linger long after the case is closed. Some are straightforward, wrapped up neatly with clear answers. Others are tangled webs that leave you with more questions than when you started. Tonight, I want to share with you a case that has stayed with me. A story that began with a shaky phone call and unfolded into something far more complex than I could have imagined. It's about a woman named Sarah and her son, Jonathan, and how fear can take hold of a family in the most unexpected ways. So, settle in, perhaps with a warm cup of tea, as I guide you through the twists and turns of this unforgettable investigation. This is the case of Sarah and Jonathan, when fear takes over.
When I spoke to Sarah that first time, her voice carried a kind of quiet panic. The letters had started to arrive, she explained. Anonymous, filled with threats. Some were directed at her, mocking her background and her life. But most were aimed at her son, Jonathan. She told me about how her phone had started buzzing with messages, racist images, disturbing pictures designed to shake her. And then there were the phone calls, silent, just breathing on the other end. Jonathan, she said, had begun to withdraw even further. He was already spending most of his time alone in his room, but now he hardly came out at all. The fear had settled into their home, like a weight no one could shake. The police, she explained, had tried to help at first, but something changed. They stopped believing her. They didn't see what she saw, didn't feel the fear creeping into every corner of her life. Still, she insisted she had been truthful, and with nowhere else to turn, had called us, hoping to find answers. It didn't take long for me to realize that a phone call wouldn't give us all the answers. We needed to see for ourselves what was happening in that house. A few days later, I made my way to Sarah's home, with Charlotte in tow. Having a female presence can make interactions like this a little easier. The sky was still heavy with clouds, the kind of day where everything feels a little slower, a little quieter. When we arrived at the council estate, there was a stillness in the air. As we approached the door, cameras were everywhere, 5 I counted, facing the front door and lawn. I noticed the curtains shift slightly. Sarah had been watching for us, waiting. When we knocked, there was a pause before she answered. We flashed our IDs to alleviate any issues she may have had. Eventually, she let us in, though there was a sense of hesitation, as if she wasn't sure she should. Then the latch was pulled, key turned. We were locked in. Inside, the house was unexpected. Although in this job, you learn to expect nothing and everything at the same time. Everything was pink, soft, pastel pink, that covered every surface. The sofas, the curtains, even the dishes on the table. Not a speck of dust in sight. It felt completely different from the image I had gathered from the phone call. It looked like the house of a person who was holding it all together. It was an overwhelming sight, but there was something unsettling beneath it all, like the house was trying to hide something. Sarah led us into the living room, her movements quick, her words rushing out. She repeated much of what she had told me on the phone, the letters, the messages, the calls. But now, seeing her in person, I could feel just how deeply this fear had taken hold of her. Her eyes flickered around the room, never resting on one thing for too long. She spoke about Jonathan, how he stayed locked in his room most of the day, alone. She said it as though she was trying to hold onto the last shred of control she had, how it was consuming her life. She sat in the window watching constantly, despite the cameras, later learning they were fake. As we sat in the pink living room, drinking tea, having paperwork pretty much thrown at us before a phone would appear in our faces, showing screenshots of horrible words and images. These were difficult to look at. It became clear that this wasn't just about the letters or the phone calls. Something else was happening in this house. Something deeper. As Sarah checked on Jonathan, we had a moment to ourselves. We both noticed the letters. Sarah had claimed they had been posted through the door while they were sleeping, or on the rare occasion they were out, but they had no creases in them, the way a letter would after being pushed through the door. No folds, completely perfect, crisp white paper. After leaving Sarah's home, exhausted, Charlotte and I knew there was more to this story than what she had told us. Something didn't feel right. How could Sarah have no idea who could be behind the threats? There was an evasiveness in her answers that left us with doubts. We had our theories, but it was too early to give them any weight. We began retracing her steps, going through the police reports, reading about the man who had been arrested but released. Sarah had insisted he was behind the messages, letters and calls. We studied the letters she had given us. Each one was filled with hate, aimed directly at her and Jonathan. The messages on her phone were worse, vicious, racist, and deeply personal. A week passed and Sarah kept calling us, updating us on every new detail. But no matter how hard we tried, the leads ran cold. It was as if we were chasing shadows. Then, one evening, Sarah called again. This time, she was frantic. Another letter had arrived, but this one was different, more explicit, more dangerous. The threats to Jonathan's life were becoming impossible to ignore. We agreed to meet her again.
Please consider subscribing to our channel to show your support. Thank you.
When we arrived at Sarah's home the second time, something had shifted. The house looked the same, still wrapped in its soft pink hues. But Sarah was different. She wasn't the nervous, anxious woman we had met before. She was angry. Her tone was sharp, her words quick and defensive. When Charlotte asked a question, Sarah snapped at her, frustration spilling over. The tension in the room was thick, like something was about to break. Jonathan was still locked away in his room, silent, invisible. The atmosphere in the house had grown darker, heavier, as if the fear itself had become another presence. It had become clear that we needed to take a different approach. Sarah had mentioned that her devices might have been hacked, so I asked her to hand them over. She complied immediately, almost too quickly, desperate for us to find answers. I spent hours going through her phones, tablets, and computers forensically. At first, everything seemed ordinary, nothing out of place, no signs of tampering. But then, something caught my attention. Bingo. The IP address. The messages Sarah had been receiving, those vicious, racist threats. They weren't coming from outside her home. They were being sent from within. The realization sank in slowly, like a heavy weight settling over the entire case. Someone inside the house had been responsible for the harassment. But who? Could Sarah, in her fear and isolation, have unknowingly created the very threats she feared? Or was Jonathan somehow involved, even with his limited understanding of the world? What a situation. Our instincts had been correct. There was something strange going on, stranger than an outsider with a grudge. The truth had hit us like a bolt. Trying to hold it together, We told Sarah we would need some time to look at the data the devices had gathered, buying us some much-needed time to approach the situation as best as possible. As the truth began to surface, the lines between victim and perpetrator blurred. The case had taken a turn none of us had expected, and suddenly the fear we had sensed in that house became something far more dangerous. Concerned for Jonathan's safety, Charlotte and I knew we had to act. We contacted the police, explaining everything we had uncovered. The messages, the IP address, the unsettling behavior. They were not surprised. They had believed after their inquiries that Jonathan was behind this, even asking for a handwritten note to compare writing styles. They had been met with defiance the whole way. Sarah had insisted her son had nothing to do with it, a detail she hadn't shared with us, and I was beginning to think they had it all right. That evening, the police arrived at Sarah's home. We didn't feel the need to be involved, and due to Sarah's conflicting and unknown behavior, we thought it best to leave this one to the authorities. Jonathan was found in his room, confused but unharmed. Sarah resisted, unable to believe that she could be at the center of the very thing she feared the most. Sometimes, the mind creates its own prisons.
This case was unlike any other we had encountered. What started as an investigation into harassment revealed something far more complex, a family trapped by fear, unable to see the walls they had built around themselves. Though the case has come to a close, the questions remain. Some stories don't have easy answers. And as we move forward, the echoes of this case will stay with us. A reminder that not every mystery comes from the outside. Sometimes, the greatest danger lies within. When Fear Takes Over has been brought to you by South Wales Private Investigations. Names and personal details have been altered to protect the privacy of those involved. For more real-life investigative stories, or if you need assistance uncovering the truth in your own life, visit our website at southwalesprivateinvestigations.co.uk. Please also consider subscribing to our channel.